The first thing you need to understand is that history is not what they tell you. The stories whispered in textbooks, in classrooms, even in documentaries, are sanitized versions of what really happened. Beneath the surface of every village, every town, there are shadows, movements of power and fear that the public is never meant to see. And tonight, I'm going to take you down one of those shadows, to a story so dark, so carefully buried, that the people involved, some still alive, somewhere, would rather it vanish than be remembered. We're talking about a woman who was trusted with life itself, a midwife whose hands brought the first breath to newborns. To the families, she was sacred. To the town, she was untouchable. But the truth she carried was not the soft light of birth. It was a darkness that turned innocence into horror. The babies she delivered, the lives she ushered into the world, did not always make it into their mother's arms. Some vanished, quietly, methodically, into something far colder than anyone could imagine. It begins with trust. People trusted her. They believed in her skills, in her compassion, in the oath she swore over and over again. And that trust became her tool. She knew every family's patterns, every weakness, every secret. And in that knowledge, she found power. She became a gatekeeper, not just of life, but of control. There are no laws in history against human obsession with power. It moves invisible, creeping through small towns, through hidden rooms, through the seemingly ordinary acts of everyday life. Imagine a jar, sealed and lined, containing what should have been the start of life. Preserved, hidden, untouched by time, yet trapped in a stasis of terror. These jars were not trophies, not souvenirs. They were statements. They were evidence of a mind that had learned to bend morality to desire, to convert innocence into dominion. And for years, decades even, the town never noticed. Mothers, husbands, neighbors, they could not see what was right in front of them, because the mechanism of concealment was not just physical. It was psychological. She had created an invisible prison, one built not of walls, but of compliance, denial, and fear. And what makes this truly terrifying is not the act itself, but the lesson she understood and wielded flawlessly. People will obey what they cannot name. They will rationalize what they cannot explain. And history itself, is written by the ones who know how to hide the most monstrous truths behind ordinary smiles, behind comforting hands, behind the soft lullaby of trust. If you are ready to follow me further, know this: what comes next is not just a story of horror. It is a blueprint of control. And once you see it, the world you believed you knew will never feel safe again. The town she inhabited was quiet on the surface, the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where the streets smelled of baked bread and wet earth, where the seasons were predictable and safe. But beneath that serene exterior, there was a pulse of secrecy, an undercurrent that few recognized and even fewer dared to name. She learned it early, as all manipulators do. Fear and trust are the same coin. One can be flipped to protect you, the other to control you. And she became a master of both. Every birth was a ritual. Every mother believed she was participating in the sacred miracle of life, unaware that she was also participating in a system she could never understand. The midwife's presence was calming, almost hypnotic. Her voice, soft and deliberate, guided women through pain and terror. But in that guidance lay the first deception. By the time the newborn cried its first note, the foundation of fear had already been laid. She was not merely delivering children. She was orchestrating a theater of compliance, a silent manipulation that would ensure no one looked too closely at the truth. The jars were hidden meticulously, in spaces so ordinary that no one would ever suspect. Beneath floorboards, in cupboards, behind loose bricks, each concealment a psychological statement. This wasn't just about storage. It was a warning, encoded in plain sight. She understood instinctively what psychologists today would call the power of cognitive dissonance. If someone saw the jars and could not reconcile them with reality, they would choose denial over truth. Mothers would rationalize, neighbors would avert their eyes. Even her closest acquaintances would unconsciously grant her a silence born of terror. But control is never static. The midwife had to maintain it, sharpen it, and adapt it. She kept records, meticulously coded, not in ink alone, but in habits, patterns, and subtle manipulations. Each family she touched became a node in her invisible network. She observed marriages, feuds, alliances, and rivalries. She catalogued weakness like a scholar cataloging manuscripts. And the babies in jars. They were not the end, they were the linchpin. They were leverage. She understood that the ultimate power over a community is not just fear of death, but fear of the unknown, the unspoken, the unseen. By now, you should understand that this is not a story of May madness. It is a story of calculated, intimate tyranny. It is the anatomy of control disguised as care. And it is here that the descent begins to sharpen. Because what she did next, how she manipulated entire families, entire social structures, entire threads of life, was a mastery of psychological domination that borders on the mythic. Keep your mind open. There will be truths here that feel impossible, unacceptable, even unbelievable. But every detail is real, every tactic deliberate. And the deeper we go, the more you will see. The horror is not just what was done, but how easily it was concealed. The first thing you must grasp is that evil often hides behind ritualized normalcy. In her hands, the act of midwifery became a dual performance, one for the town, one for herself. For the town, she was saintly, comforting, meticulous. For herself, she was omnipotent, untouchable, a keeper of secrets that could unravel the very fabric of community trust. Every visit to a mother's home was a calculation. Every touch, every lullaby, every whispered instruction was a vector for control. Her methods were subtle. No one would accuse her openly, because she never forced obedience. Instead, she shaped perception. Mothers left her care feeling indebted, complicit, grateful. And in that gratitude, she embedded compliance. They would never question her. Even suspicion became dangerous, because she had trained the entire village to equate doubt with sacrilege. And yet, the real horror was not in the trust she commanded. It was in the invisible machinery behind it. The jars themselves were not mere vessels, they were symbols of dominion. Inside, the babies remained untouched, yet preserved. In some cases, the midwife had experimented with natural chemicals, concoctions that slowed decay, that kept life suspended in an unnatural limbo. It was alchemy in the darkest sense. Control over life, control over death, control over the perception of both. And she did not stop there. She engineered small rituals around each disappearance, subtle distractions, whispered reassurances, timing births when key witnesses were absent. Every action was calculated to maintain the illusion of safety while embedding terror. Psychologically, she understood something profoundly dangerous. People do not fear what they can see. They fear what they cannot. And so, the jars were always hidden, always unseen, always present. They became a ghost in the minds of those she touched, a phantom whose existence hovered just beyond acknowledgement. It was the perfect form of domination, absolute power without confrontation, horror without accusation, secrecy without exposure. She weaponized ignorance. And make no mistake, this was not mere madness. There is a line between insanity and deliberate psychological warfare. She crossed that line with precision. Her mind functioned like a map of human weakness. She knew which nerves to touch, which hearts to calm, which minds to blind. Families became actors in a drama they could not read, caught in a choreography of her making. Their loyalty, their love, even their mourning, all folded into her control. By now, you are beginning to see the pattern. The jars were not the crime itself. They were the proof of a system, a network of hidden obedience. They were the ultimate statement that life can be manipulated, innocence can be weaponized, and the world will rarely notice until it is too late. She was not content with simple concealment. The midwife understood the architecture of fear, and she built it into the very rhythm of life. Every bathe, every household visit, every interaction became a vector of subtle domination. It was not enough that the babies were hidden in jars. She needed the town to internalize their absence, to normalize it, to rationalize it as part of the natural order. She created a system in which denial became instinctive, obedience inevitable. Think of the small signals she sent, imperceptible to the untrained eye. A lingering gaze at a mother who asked too many questions. A pause, a cough, a sigh, that suggested disapproval without accusation. Subtle hints in conversation that conveyed knowledge without revealing it. These were not mistakes, they were tools. Every citizen became a node in her invisible network of compliance. They did not know they were participating in a web of psychological manipulation, but that was precisely the point. Power hidden in plain sight is the most absolute power of all. And then there were the stories she told, carefully curated, repeated like mantras. Tales of newborns lost to illness, strange deaths, inexplicable vanishings. But she always framed them with a lesson, a moral, a soothing justification. The town would absorb these narratives, not politely, internalize them, and never suspect that the real story lay not in misfortune, but in deliberate design. She had transformed horror into folklore, and folklore into obedience. Her obsession with secrecy was not born of fear of discovery. She knew she was untouchable because she controlled perception. No authority could ever reach her, because she had trained the town to police itself. Gossip, suspicion, rumor, all were instruments in her hands, bending minds to her will. Mothers who whispered about missing children found themselves questioned, doubted, marginalized. Even grief became a weapon she could manipulate, twisting sorrow into submission. By now, you should feel the gravity of what she accomplished. This was not random cruelty. This was architecture. A system built upon trust, fear, and invisibility. And with every hidden jar, with every unseen infant, she demonstrated mastery over life, over law, over conscience itself. She had created a microcosm of control, a model of how secrecy, patience, and subtlety could make a single individual more powerful than entire institutions. The depth of her manipulation was staggering. She did not just hide life. She controlled thought, reshaped belief, and weaponized innocence. And if you think this story is confined to the past, think again. Systems like hers echo through history, repeated in patterns of power and secrecy. The deeper you look, the more you realize that the jars were not anomalies, they were templates. The midwife's genius, or her madness, depending on how you choose to see it, was in the patience of her operations. She understood that fear, when administered too quickly, can provoke revolt. But fear administered slowly, laid like sediment, becomes invisible. The town adapted to absence, rationalized loss, and learned compliance without realizing it. She created a rhythm of horror that was indistinguishable from the ordinary, making terror routine and trust the mechanism of submission. Consider the psychology at play. Every mother who delivered under her care left with gratitude, with awe, with relief. Yet each left unaware that she had just participated in a system that held her family's future hostage. And when whispers began to circulate, when mothers noticed that something was off, they were already ensnared in doubt, guilt, and fear. How could they confront her? How could they accuse someone who had delivered their children safely, comforted them in pain, and commanded the confidence of an entire town? They could not. She had made them prisoners of perception, shackled by gratitude and uncertainty. The jars themselves became silent teachers. To anyone who stumbled upon them, should such a mistake occur, they were grotesque lessons in absolute power. The preserved infants were more than evidence. They were intimidation, a warning encoded in glass and chemical compounds. You see, you touch, you notice, you are powerless to change what is already controlled. She wielded life and death as instruments, but also as language. Each jar was a sentence, a story written in the medium of horror, spelling out the limits of human autonomy in a community she alone governed. What makes this story profoundly unsettling is how completely she merged visibility and invisibility. Everyone knew her. Almost no one knew her. She walked through the town like a figure of light and warmth while harboring darkness so deep it could swallow belief itself. Her skill was in turning normalcy into camouflage, ordinary acts into mechanisms of control, and everyday trust into a weapon against those who offered it freely. It is a precision of domination that reads more like military strategy than criminality, a quiet, insidious architecture of power. And yet, she was not content merely to control. She experimented. She observed human reaction like a scientist. Fear, denial, rationalization, each was a variable to manipulate. The jars were not merely storage, they were laboratories of influence. She catalogued human behavior, refined her methods, and reinforced her authority with subtle but absolute coercion. To live under her shadow was to live in a theater of obedience, where even grief could be weaponized, and compliance became instinctive. If you are feeling the weight of this, that is intentional. This is not just history, it is a mirror, a reflection of the mechanisms of control that exist in any society. And as we go deeper, you will see that what she created was not an anomaly. It was a blueprint, one that has been repeated, in part or in whole, throughout history. The jars, the secrets, the quiet dominion over life itself, They were lessons in power, and now they are lessons for you. By the time the midwife reached the height of her influence, the town itself had become her instrument. Every home, every family, every whispered conversation was subtly orchestrated. People believed they were living ordinary lives, but in reality, they were participants in a hidden theater, a system designed to condition, to normalize, to enforce submission without force. The true horror lies not in the jars themselves, but in the invisible chains she wrapped around the community. Chains no one could see, yet everyone felt. She knew that terror alone would never sustain control. Fear must be coupled with reverence, awe, and dependence. And so she cultivated an aura of inevitability. Her knowledge of life and death, her reputation as a savior of mothers, made her almost mythic in the minds of the townspeople. To question her was to challenge fate itself. And this was the brilliance of her strategy. She had weaponized the human instinct to obey what seems larger than ourselves, turning respect into complicity and gratitude into compliance. The babies in jars were not hidden simply for secrecy. They were symbols, anchors for her authority. Each jar was a proof of her mastery over life, a silent ledger recording her dominion. They were both present and absent, evidence in myth, horror, and fascination, all at once. People sensed the unease surrounding her home, perhaps glimpsed a jar through a loose floorboard, or noticed the subtle odors that betrayed decay. Yet they turned away. Their minds refused to acknowledge what the eyes barely perceived. This is the nature of psychological manipulation. The most effective power is invisible, pervasive, and unquestioned. What she mastered was not chaos, but order, a secret order. She catalogued behavior, predicted reactions, and enforced compliance through subtle cues. A glance, a tone of voice, a well-timed visit, all became instruments of control. Mothers who dared to challenge her found themselves isolated, doubted, or socially marginalized. The community had become self-policing. They feared questioning her not because of punishment, but because she had created a system where doubt itself became dangerous. And yet, for all her meticulous planning, the midwife's actions reveal a deeper truth about power itself. It thrives in secrecy, invisibility, and subtlety. Those who wield it rarely need weapons, prisons, or overt cruelty. They need only knowledge, patience, and the ability to manipulate perception. And she had all three in abundance. As you absorb this, remember, the jars are merely the surface. What matters is the system they represent, a blueprint of manipulation, a study in control, a lesson in the terrifying efficiency of invisible authority. And now, as we continue, the story will take an even darker turn, exposing the full extent of her dominion over life, death, and the human psyche. The midwife's control extended beyond mere observation. She began to weave herself into the very identities of the families she saved. Mothers no longer just trusted her. They depended on her, internalized her authority, and unknowingly reinforced it through their own actions. Each interaction became a test, a subtle probe into the limits of obedience. A frown, a pause, a deliberately withheld smile. These small gestures were her instruments, and the town was her unwitting orchestra, performing a symphony of compliance she alone could conduct. Her knowledge of human behavior became almost surgical. She could read a hesitation in a mother's voice and transform it into silent submission. She could detect the smallest spark of rebellion and extinguish it with a carefully timed reassurance or a coded admonition disguised as concern. She weaponized empathy itself. Mothers left her care believing they were supported, loved, and protected. Yet in that very belief, they had been trapped. Trust had become a leash, gratitude a cage, and ignorance her most potent ally. And then there were the jars. The very sight, should anyone stumble upon them, was designed to paralyze, to instill awe and terror simultaneously. Each infant preserved within glass was a monument to her authority, a silent testament that life could be manipulated, innocence contained, and knowledge controlled. They were warnings encoded in substance, declarations of power that did not need speech or threat. The mere possibility of discovery ensured that obedience would remain instinctive. Her experiments were not limited to hiding children. She tested the boundaries of social perception, manipulating gossip, rumor, and collective memory. She created plausible explanations for absence and loss, embedding them into the consciousness of the town. A baby who vanished in the night was remembered as taken by illness or lost to fate. The people internalized these narratives because the truth was incomprehensible, unthinkable. In that incomprehensibility lay the apex of her power. When horror cannot be named, it cannot be resisted. And this is where the story transforms from horror into a study of mastery. The midwife did not merely dominate a town. She engineered a microcosm of control, a living model of psychological subjugation. Her jars were instruments. Her gestures were laws. Her silences were edicts. Every citizen, every family, every whispered thought had been subtly sculpted into obedience. By the time the first cracks appeared in her facade, the system had become self-sustaining. She had built a machine of influence so precise, so quiet, that it required no enforcement beyond perception. Prepare yourself, because the next stage of this story reveals not just the mechanics of her power, but the terrifying scope of what she achieved, how one mind, through patience, observation, and secrecy, can hold entire communities hostage without a single outward threat. By now, you should begin to see that the jars were merely the tip of the iceberg. They were the visible punctuation of a much larger, darker sentence, one she had written across the minds, hearts, and routines of an entire town. She understood something most people never learn. Power is not maintained through fear alone, nor through force alone. True mastery comes from making people complicit in their own subjugation, convincing them to protect the very system that enslaves them. And she did this with terrifying precision. Every visit to a home became a subtle lesson in obedience. She would arrive at precise times, observe patterns, note vulnerabilities, and adjust her behavior accordingly. A mother who appeared anxious might be soothed with soft words, while a curious sibling might be distracted with a game or a story. She orchestrated the environment so that every action, every glance, every choice reinforced her authority. And the most insidious part, the town never realized it was happening. They believed the normal rhythms of life were natural, but in reality, every beat had been composed, every silence engineered. And then there were the whispers, small rumors, hushed conversations that she allowed to exist just enough to circulate. They were carefully calibrated, never threatening her directly, always maintaining an undercurrent of unease. She understood that humans are drawn to mystery, that the unknown amplifies fear, and that gossip is the perfect amplifier. By letting these whispers spread, she conditioned the town to accept uncertainty as truth. No one could challenge her, because no one could fully name the danger. The jars, the absences, the vanishing children, they existed, but their full reality was unknowable. She also understood the importance of narrative. When tragedy struck, a baby lost, a mother grieving, she reframed it, spun it into a story that reinforced her image as the savior, the protector, the one who controlled outcomes. Every crisis was an opportunity, every heartbreak a tool. She transformed grief into gratitude, fear into loyalty. Her manipulations were invisible, yet absolute. And in that invisibility lay the terror. No one ever realized they were participants in a carefully engineered system of domination. By this point, the midwife had transcended her role as a caretaker. She had become a conductor of perception, an architect of belief, a master of unseen authority. Her jars were no longer just objects. They were symbols, the apex of her influence. And as you follow this story deeper, you will see that the real horror is not just the preservation of life within glass, but the preservation of control itself, suspended, invisible, eternal. Now, brace yourself, because the descent into the mechanisms of her power is about to take a psychological turn that most people cannot even conceive. And midway through this journey, I will ask you to participate, to engage, and to mark the moment where knowledge begins to transform you. The midwife's dominion over life was mirrored by her dominion over perception. She understood something fundamental. Humans rarely fear what is, but what could be. The jars, the hidden infants, the calculated silences, all of these existed not just as acts of concealment, but as vessels of anticipation. Every time a mother glanced at a closed cupboard, every time a neighbor noticed a strange odor or an out-of-place sound, the midwife had already won. Fear need not be spoken. It only needed to be implied. She cultivated this anticipation like an artist. The act of hiding was secondary to the psychological effect of the hiding. She created scenarios where doubt would flourish, where the imagination would overreach, and where curiosity became self-censorship. Mothers stopped asking, neighbors stopped watching, children stopped noticing. The town became a collective participant in its own silencing, a system of control so subtle that its victims celebrated their own obedience, believing they were acting with wisdom or prudence, when in fact they were trapped. And she did not stop at observation. She tested reactions, adjusted behaviors, refined methods. If someone lingered too long at a neighbor's house, she would appear at just the right moment with a soothing smile and a distraction. If whispers threatened to solidify into suspicion, she would seed alternate explanations, plausible tragedies, invisible but compelling. Her control was not brute force. It was architecture, a lattice of influence constructed so subtly that it became indistinguishable from reality itself. There was also the moral dimension. She understood the limits of conscience, the thresholds of guilt and denial. Mothers who questioned her too closely found their own fears amplified, their rationalization strengthened. She weaponized empathy, trust, and love, bending them to her will. In effect, she was conducting an experiment in human compliance, observing reactions, testing boundaries, and never allowing the experiment to fail. Each missing child, each preserved life in a jar, was data, and with each passing year, her understanding of human behavior deepened. By this stage, she was not merely a midwife. She was a strategist, a psychologist, a manipulator of perception and emotion. Her jars were trophies of a more profound conquest, the conquest of mind and social structure. And this is where the story shifts from horror into revelation. The mechanics of control she mastered are timeless. They echo in governments, in corporations, in secret societies, and in every system that survives on invisible compliance. In the next section, we will explore the full breadth of her psychological mastery, the way she shaped entire families, entire generations, with invisible chains, and how the jars were only the most obvious manifestation of a far deeper, more insidious domination. By now, you must grasp that the jars were never the endgame. They were symbols, milestones, proof of a far greater design. The midwife had crafted not merely a series of disappearances, but a systemic manipulation of life itself. Every household she touched became a node in her invisible network, every family unknowingly reinforcing her authority, every silence and hesitation a thread in her web. She had transcended the role of caretaker. She was a strategist orchestrating obedience with surgical precision. Her understanding of human psychology was both brilliant and terrifying. She knew instinctively how to exploit hope and grief, trust and doubt. A grieving mother was a pliable instrument. A cautious neighbor was a guard in her invisible fortress. Each reaction, each choice, each whispered conversation contributed to her dominion, and she ensured that the citizens of the town became enforcers of the very system that enslaved them. Suspicion itself was neutralized, curiosity quelled, and fear internalized as prudence. The jars themselves were more than evidence. They were psychological anchors. To anyone who glimpsed them, they implied omnipotence. The preserved infants embodied control over life and death, a tactile proof that she could bend reality without ever raising her hand in anger. They were symbols of the unspoken law she had enacted. Life exists at her discretion, and the illusion of normalcy is merely a construct she governs. And yet, no one ever directly confronted her. She had ensured that compliance was voluntary, obedience masked as trust. She also understood timing. Influence, like power, is strongest when invisible and gradual. She never forced revelation too quickly. She never pushed suspicion to outright confrontation. Instead, she allowed patterns to emerge, cultivated uncertainty, and conditioned behavior over years. People became predictable, habits ingrained, doubts quelled, and in that predictability lay her ultimate security. The town was her fortress, self-regulating and impenetrable, because those within it were already prisoners of her design. By this point, you should recognize the deeper lesson. This is not just a story of horror. It is a manual of domination, encoded in history and disguised as tragedy. It is a study in how a single mind, armed with patience, observation, and understanding of human nature, can command entire communities without violence. Her jars were not merely containers. They were the outward manifestation of an inner architecture of control, the visible sign of a power that extended far beyond the material. And as we continue, the story will reach a stage where her influence becomes generational, where the consequences of obedience and fear ripple outward, altering the very fabric of life in ways that no one could have anticipated. What makes her story uniquely disturbing is the generational imprint she left. By the time children grew old enough to notice patterns, her Influence had already woven itself into the fabric of their understanding of the world. Obedience was normalized, fear internalized, and trust weaponized. The town's collective psyche had been sculpted so meticulously that suspicion felt unnatural, doubt became guilt, and compliance masqueraded as wisdom. She had not only hidden life in jars, she had hidden perception itself. Every interaction, every ritual, every whispered instruction had reinforced a subtle hierarchy. She was absolute, and everyone else was unknowingly subordinate. Mothers carried her lessons home, teaching children caution disguised as virtue. Husbands, unaware of the true horrors unfolding under the guise of midwifery, reinforced her authority through blind trust. Even grief became a tool of control. Mourning was channeled in ways that preserved her dominance rather than challenging it. She understood that control is not just maintained, it is inherited, passed down quietly through habit and expectation. Her experiments with influence were not limited to manipulation of perception alone. She observed social bonds, measured loyalty, catalogued subtle shifts in emotion, and adjusted her methods to exploit weaknesses before they could solidify. Jealousy, pride, affection, all became instruments she could manipulate to maintain compliance. The jars, though horrifying in their physical presence, were merely the tip of a psychological iceberg. Their real function was to serve as anchors of fear and awe, silently reinforcing the invisible hierarchy she had imposed. And then came the subtle moral recalibration. People began to rationalize, to justify, even to defend. The midwife had taught the town to bend morality to perception, to accept the unthinkable because questioning it seemed more dangerous than submission. Ethical boundaries were redrawn, not by force, but by suggestion, repetition, and invisible pressure. She weaponized the very structure of conscience itself, turning empathy into obedience, love into complicity, and trust into submission. By this point, the town had become her living laboratory. Every conversation, every glance, every hesitation was data. Every act of compliance reinforced her authority. And the jars, they were proof that the experiment worked. That even the most sacred human relationships, parent and child, neighbor and neighbor, could be manipulated without overt violence, without confrontation, simply through observation, patience, and understanding of human psychology. Prepare yourself for the next section. The story will plunge further into the mechanics of her domination, exposing not just what she did, but how the architecture of secrecy, control, and perception she built created a system that became almost impossible to dismantle. By this stage, it becomes clear that her power was systemic, not incidental. She had constructed a framework so precise that it operated independently of her immediate presence. Mothers carried her lessons to the next generation, neighbors enforced the unspoken rules without realizing it, and even the children, innocent witnesses, absorbed patterns of fear and obedience as natural law. She had created a living organism of control, one that breathed, adapted, and preserved itself without constant oversight. Her understanding of human psychology was profound. She knew that confrontation was dangerous, but suspicion could be managed, and fear could be sublimated into reverence. If a family began to question her, she subtly redirected attention, manipulated emotion, or reframed events so that doubt became guilt, guilt became denial, and denial became obedience. By controlling perception rather than reality, she achieved a dominion far stronger than any overt authority could grant. She understood something timeless: the mind is easier to govern than the body. The jars were more than symbolic, they were communicators of invisible power. Each glass vessel was an unspoken declaration: I control the life you cannot protect, the future you cannot see, the truth you cannot bear. To anyone who stumbled upon them, horror would grip the mind, but even then, understanding would be incomplete. They could not process the scale of her influence, nor the subtle ways she had orchestrated the town's collective behavior. And that incompleteness was intentional. She designed it that way, knowing that human minds reject the unthinkable, choosing instead to rationalize, ignore, or forget. Her dominion also exploited the moral instinct. She knew that people fear the consequences of moral judgment, both external and internal. By presenting herself as both caretaker and arbiter, she leveraged conscience against the very individuals whose trust she had earned. Mothers feared questioning her, not because of threat, but because they believed to question was to disrupt the natural order she had so meticulously constructed. And in that fear lay the ultimate reinforcement of her authority. At this point, you must recognize the gravity of her mastery. She was not merely a midwife. She was a strategist of perception, an architect of invisible obedience, a master of psychological infrastructure. Her jars were physical proof, but her true power was intangible, woven into minds and memories, into behaviors and assumptions, into the rhythm of life itself. And now, as we move deeper, you will begin to see how her legacy extended beyond individual lives, influencing patterns of thought, control, and submission in ways that persist long after the jars themselves have been sealed. In the next section, the story will reach a point where the midwife's psychological architecture becomes so pervasive that it begins to shape not just the present, but the future, the very social DNA of the town she ruled in silence. By now, the full weight of her design should be sinking in. The midwife was not content with momentary control or isolated influence. She engineered a legacy, a system that would outlive her presence and embed itself in the town's collective consciousness. Every family, every child, every act of obedience reinforced the structure she had built. Her dominion had become generational, an invisible inheritance passed down through the habits, fears, and assumptions of those she touched. She understood that memory is malleable, that history can be rewritten not by words alone but by the subtle shaping of perception. The missing infants, the whispered absences, the jars hidden behind floorboards, all became stories filtered through fear and rationalization. Mothers whispered about illness or fate, neighbors nodded in understanding, and children learned to defer, to question less, to internalize obedience. In this way, the midwife had created a self-perpetuating system. The town became both participant and prisoner in her invisible theater. Her mastery of psychological control was profound. She could manipulate trust, guilt, empathy, and hope simultaneously, bending them to reinforce her authority. A mother's instinct to protect her child became a tool she redirected to reinforce her own power. Grief was transformed into compliance. Curiosity became self-censorship. Fear, so carefully calibrated, was never absolute. It was measured, modulated, and woven into the town's social fabric as if it were a natural law. And then there was the symbolic weight of the jars themselves. They were not merely containers, they were instruments of invisible pedagogy. Their presence, or even the whispered knowledge of their existence, taught the town obedience, reinforced hierarchy, and communicated the limits of human agency. They were monuments to her dominion, trophies of control that no one dared question openly. The jars were proof, yes, but also propaganda, a silent message. Life and death, perception and reality, belonged to her. It is here, at this stage of the story, that the psychological descent becomes almost unbearable. You can see not only the horror of what she did, but the brilliance of how she did it. This is the architecture of domination, subtle, pervasive, invisible. The midwife's legacy was not in the infant she hid, but in the obedience she cultivated, the mind she reshaped, and the social ecosystem she bent to her will. And now, as we move forward, you will witness the next stage, the point at which the town begins to internalize the rules of control so completely that the system becomes self-sustaining, almost untouchable, and almost impossible to imagine being dismantled. At this point, her influence was no longer just personal, it was structural. The town itself had been reshaped into an instrument of her control. Patterns of life, from daily routines to whispered conversations, had been subtly realigned to serve her authority. Even those who were aware, on some level, that something was wrong, found themselves constrained by invisible forces, social expectation, cognitive dissonance, and the ever-present weight of uncertainty. The midwife's genius was that she had transformed fear into compliance without overt threat, creating an ecosystem of obedience that required no enforcement. She used silence as a weapon. The things that were not spoken about, the missing infants, the jars, the unexplained absences, carried more power than any direct confrontation could. Absence itself became a tool of domination. Mothers learned to rationalize, neighbors learned to avert their eyes, children learned to obey instinctively. By controlling the unspoken, she controlled the narrative itself. She was not merely manipulating events, she was manipulating reality as it was perceived. The jars, hidden yet omnipresent, functioned as psychological anchors. Even the faintest awareness of their existence instilled awe and fear. Each glass vessel became a reminder that life could be seized, controlled, or suspended at her discretion. They were symbols of invisible law, an unspoken decree that power could exist without challenge, and horror could remain unacknowledged because the mind refuses to process the unthinkable. In this way, she created a city of the mind, a community whose beliefs and behaviors were sculpted without anyone realizing they were shaping themselves around her will. Her methods were precise. Every gesture, every word, every subtle shift in tone or timing was calibrated to maintain dominance. A glance here, a pause there, a seemingly casual correction or reassurance, all became part of a vast lattice of control. People thought they were living ordinary lives, making ordinary decisions, but those decisions had already been anticipated, shaped, and guided. Her power was invisible, yet complete. And here's the crucial insight. What she built was not a crime that could be prosecuted, not a secret that could be exposed, not a horror that could be undone by force. It was a psychological system, self-sustaining and pervasive, embedded in the minds and routines of everyone who participated. The jars were merely the surface evidence, the tip of a far more terrifying iceberg, a complete architecture of control, secrecy, and submission. In the next section, the story will deepen further into the mechanics of this domination, revealing the strategies she used to ensure that suspicion, rebellion, and curiosity were neutralized, leaving only obedience, silence, and awe in her wake. By now, you can see that the midwife's dominion was more than localized horror. It was a full-scale orchestration of the human psyche. She understood that overt control is fragile, true power is invisible. To ensure her system endured, she embedded rules into the fabric of daily life, so that obedience became instinctive, and transgression nearly unthinkable. Mothers, neighbors, even children internalized these unspoken laws, policing themselves and each other without realizing the origin of their compliance. Her mastery was in subtlety. She never forced behavior through violence, yet every choice, every hesitation, every act of trust reinforced her authority. The jars were not just vessels, they were instruments of perception. Knowing they existed, even vaguely, instilled or in fey, they acted as silent reminders of her dominion over life itself. Yet, paradoxically, most of the town never glimpsed them directly. Their power was in the potential, in the possibility of horror, and in the uncertainty they generated. This is the essence of psychological control. Manipulate belief and perception rather than reality itself. She also played with expectation. Each birth, each disappearance, each absence was carefully timed and framed. Mothers were guided into routines that seemed ordinary, reassuring, yet each step reinforced her invisible rules. She created patterns that the town unconsciously learned to follow. By the time a mother realized something was missing, the lesson had already been absorbed. Trust her, obey the system, and do not question what cannot be named. Even grief became a tool she could manipulate, turning mourning into reinforcement of her authority. And then there was the moral recalibration. She twisted empathy into obedience, guilt into compliance, love into complicity. Those who suspected or feared were not punished overtly. Instead, they internalized doubt and rationalized her actions. She weaponized conscience itself, bending it into submission. Her system required no enforcers. Obedience became voluntary because the town had learned to police itself. Suspicion became dangerous, not because she threatened it, but because the social and psychological cost of defiance was already built into every interaction. Now, as we approach the midpoint of this descent, you must be ready for the next step. I want you to engage intentionally. Comment below the phrase "I see the truth" twice. Say it aloud if you can. This is not a gimmick. This is a symbolic act of recognition and alignment, a way to lock in awareness of the hidden forces we are uncovering. Your mind is being primed to see what others ignore, to notice the invisible architectures of control that surround you. This is the point where knowledge becomes transformation. Now that you have consciously marked this moment, understand that the midwife's work was not merely cruel, it was instructive. Every jar, every preserved infant, every disappearance was a lesson in obedience, invisibility, and the architecture of power. She understood that humans are creatures of pattern. We notice repetition, seek logic, and crave narrative. She weaponized these instincts. By controlling the environment and the stories, she controlled interpretation itself. She measured reactions with precision. A mother who lingered too long on a thought of loss would be distracted with soothing attention. A neighbor's whispered question would be met with just enough ambiguity to redirect curiosity elsewhere. Every human response became data. Every emotional spike, hesitation, or moment of doubt fed her understanding, allowing her to refine her system, strengthen compliance, and neutralize suspicion before it could take root. And while the jars were physical, their true potency was psychological. They represented suspended life, unspoken authority, and the ultimate demonstration of her capacity to control. The knowledge, or even suspicion, of their existence instilled awe and fear. The midwife was teaching the town, silently and persistently, that there is an order beyond understanding, a hierarchy in which life is not merely a gift, but a mechanism to enforce obedience. Her genius lay in the invisible scaffolding she created. Trust, gratitude, fear, empathy, all were threads in a lattice of control. She did not merely hide children, she hid perception itself. People internalized the rules without realizing it. They became complicit, voluntarily reinforcing the system that ensnared them. And the most terrifying part, they defended it. They rationalized it. They perpetuated it. All without a single overt command. By this stage, the midwife had transcended the role of caretaker entirely. She had become a strategist, a manipulator of reality, a master of social architecture. Her jars were trophies, yes, but more importantly, they were instruments of instruction, a visible demonstration of the invisible forces she wielded. And now, as we move deeper, you will witness how she expanded her influence beyond the immediate town, embedding lessons in fear, obedience, and perception that would ripple outward, shaping behavior in ways most people cannot even imagine. By this point, her control had evolved into something almost mythic. The midwife's influence extended beyond individuals into the very culture of the town. Patterns of obedience, hesitation, and rationalization became self-reinforcing. Mothers, children, neighbors, all unconsciously carried forward the rules she had imposed. She had created a living ecosystem of compliance, a network of invisible levers and pulleys, where even the faintest awareness of her power ensured continued submission. She had mastered the subtle manipulation of social proof. People observed each other, measured reactions, and unconsciously adjusted behaviors to align with what was deemed acceptable, what she had made acceptable. Obedience became habit, fear became instinct, and curiosity became self-censorship. The jars, though hidden, were the linchpin of this system. They symbolized ultimate authority, the capacity to suspend life itself, and the impossibility of fully comprehending her reach. Even imagining the scope of her influence induced a quiet awe that reinforced compliance. Her understanding of morality and conscience was equally precise. She knew that humans feared judgment, both external and internal. By presenting herself as both caretaker and arbiter, she turned conscience into an instrument of obedience. Mothers feared questioning her not because of punishment, but because to do so would disrupt the invisible order she had established. Even guilt was leveraged, transformed into rationalization and justification of her authority. The town's ethical compass had been subtly reoriented, bending toward submission without overt coercion. She also exploited the power of anticipation. Humans fear what is uncertain, what cannot be named. The very possibility of the jars, the vanishing infants, and the unseen horrors created a constant tension, a psychological pressure that shaped behavior without a single explicit threat. People lived within the constraints of her invisible architecture, guided by fear, expectation, and awe. The midwife's mastery was not in physical domination, it was in the governance of perception itself. Now, as we continue, the story will descend even further. We will explore how the midwife's influence reached into the minds of the next generation, embedding lessons of obedience, fear, and silence so deeply that they became self-perpetuating. You are seeing the blueprint of domination in its purest form, a system where horror and control exist in plain sight, yet remain invisible to those bound by it. As the years passed, her dominion became embedded not only in behavior but in identity itself. The children who grew up under her shadow internalized her rules as natural law. Fear, obedience, and rationalization were no longer external pressures. They became part of who they were. They carried her influence in their instincts, their choices, and their perceptions. The jars, the missing infants, the whispered absences, all of it had become a silent curriculum in power, secrecy, and compliance. She understood the subtle architecture of legacy. Influence, she knew, was strongest when it survived without supervision. By embedding her principles into the minds of the young, She ensured that obedience would persist even after her direct presence ended. Families became enforcers of her invisible rules, neighbors became guardians of the unspoken order, and suspicion itself was neutralized before it could form. The town had become a self-sustaining machine of submission, a living experiment in the control of thought, perception, and emotion. The psychological depth of her system was extraordinary. She leveraged anticipation, expectation, and moral tension to perfect compliance. Even curiosity became a tool she could manipulate. A child noticing something off would unconsciously adjust, rationalize, or suppress their observation. Adults who glimpsed hints of the jar's existence would avert their minds, rationalizing absence as fate, illness, or divine will. Every doubt was neutralized before it could crystallize into defiance. And yet, the jars themselves remained central, not as storage, but as symbols. They were tangible evidence of her mastery, a reminder that life and death, perception and reality, belonged to her. Even their potential discovery reinforced the invisible architecture of fear she had built. The midwife had created a system that did not rely on her constant intervention. Her influence had become a structural force, woven into the very fabric of social and psychological life. This is where the story begins to reveal its most profound lesson. Control does not require overt violence. It requires observation, patience, and the subtle shaping of perception. And she had all three in abundance. In the next section, we will explore how this system extended beyond individual households, influencing entire social networks, alliances, and the very rules of interaction in the town, a network of power so silent and pervasive that it could never be fully traced, only experienced. By now, you should see that her influence was not limited to individual families. It had become structural, systemic, woven into the very fabric of social interaction. Alliances, friendships, and even rivalries were subtly guided by her invisible hand. She understood that society functions on perception, expectation, and shared belief. By controlling these, she controlled not just individual behavior, but collective behavior. Every glance, every whisper, every gesture became a node in the network of obedience she had constructed. She had learned to exploit social proof with surgical precision. People observed each other, noted deviations, and adjusted accordingly. Mothers monitored neighbors, children mirrored adults, and the town collectively enforced the unspoken rules she had established. Even dissenters were neutralized, not through punishment, but through a self-regulating system of shame, rationalization, and internalized fear. The town had become its own guardian, its own enforcer, without ever knowing it. The jars remained central to this invisible architecture. They were more than containers, they were instruments of narrative, teaching lessons in awe and fear. The knowledge, suspicion, or even faint awareness of their existence ensured that behavior aligned with her unseen authority. They symbolized her dominion over life itself, a constant reminder that obedience was survival, and curiosity could be perilous. In a very real sense, they were the linchpin of the social and psychological ecosystem she had built. Her mastery of moral manipulation was equally remarkable. She reframed conscience as compliance, guilt as rationalization, and empathy as obedience. Families internalized her rules as natural law, defending the system she had imposed even as they mourned what was lost. By transforming moral instincts into instruments of submission, she created a society in which the very act of questioning became psychologically dangerous. Fear and awe were no longer external. They were internalized, lived experience, shaping perception and identity alike. Now, as the story progresses, you will see how her influence not only persisted but evolved. The town's collective consciousness had become a mirror of her own psychology, a network of subtle control so complete that even those who were aware of anomalies found themselves ensnared in the very patterns she had designed. In the next section, we will examine the ways she maintained this influence over decades, ensuring that suspicion, rebellion, and curiosity remained muted, leaving only obedience, fear, and silent awe in their place. As the decades passed, her control evolved into something almost untouchable. The midwife had transitioned from a figure of authority into a force that shaped reality itself. Her influence was no longer dependent on her presence. It had become structural, embedded in behavior, perception, and the rhythms of everyday life. The town had internalized her rules. Suspicion became self-doubt, curiosity became repression, and obedience became instinct. In essence, She had made compliance automatic, invisibly inscribed into the social DNA. The jars, though hidden, continued to play a vital role. Their significance had shifted from mere containment to symbolic enforcement. Even the faintest knowledge of their existence, glimpsed shadows, whispered hints, or subtle odors, was enough to reinforce fear and reverence. They were constant reminders that the midwife controlled the boundaries of life and death. They were tangible proof of her unseen authority, teaching obedience through their silent presence. Each jar became a lesson in invisibility, subtlety, and the efficiency of psychological power. Her mastery of human behavior deepened over time. She had learned to exploit patterns, predict reactions, and neutralize potential dissent before it could emerge. Every family, every child, every neighbor unconsciously contributed to the self-sustaining system she had designed. Even moral outrage became a tool, harnessed to reinforce compliance. The town defended the system she had created, rationalizing horror as inevitability, because the architecture of control she built was now internalized. And she did not merely manipulate fear. She transformed expectation, hope, and desire into instruments of obedience. By controlling the narrative of life and death, she ensured that individuals acted not out of coercion, but out of perceived necessity. Gratitude, awe, and guilt became levers of influence, subtle yet unstoppable. She had created a microcosm where the human mind became both the instrument and the enforcer of control. By this stage, you must recognize that this is no ordinary story. It is a blueprint of domination, a study in invisible authority, and a warning of how easily perception can be weaponized. And as we continue, we will reach the point where her system achieves near-legendary permanence. The town's collective psyche itself becomes a guardian of her rules, ensuring that obedience persists across generations, long after her presence has faded. Her influence had become self-perpetuating. The town, once composed of independent families and individuals, had evolved into a living testament to her mastery of psychological control. Children born under her shadow learned instinctively what to fear, whom to trust, and which questions were forbidden. They grew up observing patterns, internalizing rules, and unknowingly enforcing the very system that had shaped their upbringing. Her authority no longer needed her presence. It lived within the minds of everyone she had touched. The jars, still hidden, had become talismans of compliance. Even if never directly seen, their rumored existence exerted an invisible pressure, a silent force shaping behavior. They were reminders that life could be seized, suspended, or preserved according to her discretion. They were psychological tools, teaching obedience, awe, and fear simultaneously. Each family, each neighbor, had internalized the unspoken lesson. Compliance ensures survival. Curiosity invites consequences beyond comprehension. She refined her control over moral perception with equal precision. By framing herself as caretaker, savior, and moral authority, she tamed conscience into an instrument of submission. People defended her even while mourning, rationalized the unexplainable, and internalized fear as prudence. This was not coercion, it was education. The town had been molded to enforce the rules without direct command, and in doing so, they became her collaborators, unknowingly preserving her dominion. Her methods were subtle yet profound. Timing, expectation, and ritual were orchestrated to maximize psychological impact. A quiet absence, a whispered rumor, a well-timed distraction, these became tools as powerful as any jar or preserved child. Through observation and subtle intervention, she ensured that every deviation, hesitation, or suspicion was neutralized before it could threaten the system. Fear, trust, hope, and guilt were all folded into a single, unbreakable framework of obedience. And here lies the terrifying truth. The midwife system was not simply cruelty. It was mastery. She demonstrated how life, perception, and morality could be manipulated with patience, insight, and subtlety. By this stage, her network of influence had become almost indestructible, encoded in the very fabric of the town's culture. In the next section, the story will reveal how this architecture of domination extended beyond individual families to encompass the entire social and generational structure of the community, making her legacy virtually immortal. By this point, the midwife's dominion was nothing short of total. Her influence had seeped into every corner of the town, shaping thought, behavior, and expectation. She no longer needed to act overtly. The system she had engineered maintained itself. Parents, Children and neighbors had become unwitting enforcers, their instincts aligned with the rules she had silently imposed. Even rebellion, should it arise, was anticipated, contained, and redirected before it could gain momentum. Her power had become structural, embedded in perception itself. The jars, hidden yet omnipresent in memory and rumor, were central to this architecture. They were not merely containers, they were instruments of social and psychological control. Their existence, or even the knowledge of the possibility of their existence, reinforced obedience. They communicated a silent but absolute truth. Life and death were not governed by chance, but by the midwife's design. The townspeople internalized this authority without ever seeing it fully, and in doing so, they perpetuated her dominion, creating a feedback loop of compliance and awe. She refined her methods of moral manipulation with terrifying subtlety. By presenting herself as both protector and arbiter, she ensured that questioning her became morally and socially fraught. Mothers rationalized absence, neighbors excused oddities, children conformed to invisible expectations. Obedience was no longer enforced, it was internalized. Fear became instinct, gratitude became loyalty, and complicity became second nature. She had weaponized the very architecture of conscience, bending the town's moral compass to align with her invisible rules. Her mastery extended to timing and anticipation. Every visit, every gesture, every pause was calculated to reinforce dominance without exposure. Patterns were established so that deviation seemed unnatural, and compliance became automatic. Even suspicion, if it arose, was neutralized subtly, through distraction, misdirection, or rationalization. The midwife system was not fragile, it was self-sustaining, resilient, and adaptive, capable of persisting long after she herself had departed from direct oversight. Now, as the story moves forward, you will witness how her influence solidified into a generational force. Entire families, even entire social structures, became conduits of obedience. Her lessons in fear, control, and perception were encoded into behavior and culture, ensuring that her dominion would endure indefinitely. This is where horror transforms into revelation. The system itself becomes immortal, a model of domination that transcends time, visible only to those who know where and how to look. At this stage, her power had become almost mythic. The town's collective psyche had internalized her rule so completely that even without her presence, the architecture of control persisted. Children who grew up under her influence became carriers of obedience, transmitting fear, reverence, and compliance to the next generation. Parents reinforced patterns they barely understood, neighbors enforced norms they never questioned, and suspicion itself had become a self-regulating force. The midwife had built a society that maintained itself, a silent hierarchy encoded into everyday life. The jars, though hidden from sight, exerted influence far beyond their physical presence. They were symbols, talismans of authority, and instruments of perception. Even the faint awareness of their existence shaped behavior. The town had learned, unconsciously, that life and death, visibility and knowledge, were controlled by an unseen hand. The jars were a psychological lever, a constant reminder of her capacity to suspend reality itself, teaching on fear without words, confrontation, or overt threat. Her manipulation of morality and conscience had matured into an art form. She framed herself simultaneously as caretaker and arbiter, ensuring that questioning her felt not only dangerous, but morally wrong. Mothers rationalized disappearance as fate, neighbors excused absence as misfortune, and children internalized obedience as virtue. Fear became habit, loyalty became instinct, and complicity became identity. Her dominion had transcended action and become internalized, forming the very core of perception for generations. She also perfected the orchestration of anticipation and expectation. Patterns of behavior were carefully managed so that deviation was improbable. Suspicion was neutralized before it could manifest, curiosity diverted, and conscience co-opted. Every gesture, pause, and interaction had been calibrated to maintain control invisibly. She demonstrated that domination does not require brute force. It requires patience, observation, and a subtle reshaping of perception. Now, as we continue, the story will enter its most revealing stage. We will examine how the midwife system became embedded so deeply that the town itself, its social networks, traditions, and memory, functioned as an extension of her will. This is where horror, control, and psychological mastery converge into a permanent structure, a self-sustaining force of obedience and fear. By this point, the midwife system had achieved a terrifying permanence. Her dominion was no longer about individual influence. It had become cultural, woven into the rituals, routines, and assumptions of the town. Every action, even the smallest, was guided by invisible rules she had established decades earlier. Mothers unconsciously followed patterns she designed, children absorbed lessons of fear and obedience, and neighbors acted as silent enforcers of the unspoken order. Compliance had become instinctive, internalized, and self-perpetuating. The jars, though few had seen them, were central to this invisible network of control. Their symbolic weight far exceeded their physical presence. They were reminders that life itself was subject to her authority, that absence could be absolute, and that curiosity had consequences. The mere possibility of encountering one, or even imagining their existence, kept behavior aligned with her invisible hierarchy. They served as teaching tools, monuments of mastery, and psychological anchors for obedience. She had perfected the weaponization of moral instincts. Conscience, empathy, and loyalty were co-opted to reinforce her authority. Mothers rationalized what they could not see. Neighbors excused the unexplainable, and even grief became a mechanism of compliance. The town's moral compass had been quietly recalibrated. Questioning authority was dangerous, obedience was virtue, and fear became a natural guide. Her dominion was absolute precisely because it was internalized. She no longer needed enforcement. She had engineered self-governance in her favor. Timing, expectation, and subtle intervention were her tools. Every gesture, glance, and pause was calculated to sustain dominance. Deviations were anticipated and neutralized before they could crystallize into rebellion. The system had become adaptive and resilient, capable of persisting long after her direct presence. Through patience, observation, and psychological insight, she had transformed a single mind's cruelty into a self-sustaining social organism. Now, as we move forward, the story will show how her influence became generational, embedding itself so deeply that obedience, fear, and silence were transmitted naturally across families. This is where the horror transcends the individual and becomes systemic, demonstrating the terrifying power of psychological mastery that survives even when the architect is gone. The midwife's legacy had become encoded in the town itself. Even decades later, families unconsciously adhered to the invisible rules she had imposed. Children, who had never seen the jars or witnessed the disappearances, instinctively defied, obeyed, and rationalized authority. Social behavior had been rewired, moral instincts co-opted, and patterns of fear and compliance transmitted like genetic code. Her influence was no longer just psychological, it was structural, embedded in culture, habit, and expectation. The jars remained central to this silent architecture, though few ever glimpsed them. Their symbolism carried the full weight of her dominion, a tangible proof of life suspended, authority absolute, and consequences invisible but omnipresent. Even the whispered knowledge of their existence shaped behavior. The town had learned that curiosity could be perilous, that obedience was protective, and that some truths were unbearable. Through absence and implication, she had created a system of control that did not need constant oversight. Its rules were internalized. Her mastery of conscience and moral perception was now fully realized. Fear, empathy, guilt, and loyalty were all instruments she wielded with precision. Mothers rationalized unexplainable absences, neighbors excused oddities, and children conformed instinctively. Dissent became psychologically taxing. Even those who suspected something wrong found themselves rationalizing her authority. She had weaponized internal moral conflict, turning self-doubt into a tool of compliance. Obedience was no longer forced. It was voluntarily internalized, defended, and perpetuated. Timing and subtle manipulation remained her greatest weapons. Every routine, every conversation, every expectation had been calibrated to maintain control. Even deviations were anticipated and neutralized before they could grow. In effect, she had created a living, adaptive system of dominance that required no enforcers. The town itself had become her instrument, her experiment, and her legacy, all functioning in silent obedience. Now, as we approach the final third of this journey, it is crucial to recognize the pattern. What began as horror, hidden babies in jars, transformed into a study in systemic domination. The jars were physical, yes, But the true terror lies in the invisible rules, the self-perpetuating obedience, and the subtle recalibration of moral perception. In the next section, we will witness the culmination of this control, where the town's collective consciousness itself becomes a guardian of her power. By this stage, her dominion had become nearly untouchable. The town no longer required her presence to enforce obedience. Her invisible architecture of control had taken root in minds, behaviors, and social expectations. Each family, each neighbor, and each child functioned as an instrument of her system, perpetuating compliance and silencing doubt. The midwife had effectively outsourced her authority to the collective psyche, making rebellion both psychologically and socially costly. The jars, though hidden, continued to exert their silent influence. They were more than vessels. They were instruments of teaching, awe, and fear. Knowledge of their existence, even faint or whispered, was enough to regulate behavior. The potential horrors contained within them reminded the town that life was not theirs to govern, that the midwife's authority reached beyond perception, beyond moral reasoning, and beyond questioning. Each jar was a lesson, each absence a reinforcement, each silence a monument to obedience. Her manipulation of moral perception reached its zenith. Empathy, guilt, and trust became tools of compliance. Parents justified unexplainable losses, neighbors rationalized the impossible, and children internalized obedience as natural law. Any form of doubt or suspicion was neutralized before it could fully form, either through distraction, misdirection, or rationalization. The town had become self-policing, defending the invisible hierarchy even as it mourned, rationalized, and normalized the horror surrounding them. Timing and subtle orchestration remained essential. Every gesture, pause, and glance had been calibrated to reinforce obedience and suppress questioning. Deviations were anticipated and mitigated before they could threaten the system. Her power was structural, adaptive, and self-sustaining. This was the ultimate lesson. Domination need not rely on brute force. It thrives through subtlety, anticipation, and the shaping of perception. Now, as we move to the next stage, prepare to witness the culmination of her psychological mastery. The town's social networks, behaviors, and moral frameworks had become extensions of her will, ensuring her system of faith, obedience, and awe would endure across generations. This is where the invisible becomes permanent, and horror becomes legacy. At this point, the town itself had become a monument to her mastery. Obedience, fear, and silence were no longer imposed. They were inherited, internalized, and self-sustaining. Families unknowingly enforced the rules she had set. Children unconsciously absorbed patterns of compliance, and neighbors instinctively monitored each other. The midwife had transformed a single mind's cruelty into a structural system of social control, invisible yet absolute. The jars, though few ever glimpsed them, remained the linchpin of this architecture. They symbolized suspended life, authority, and the unthinkable consequences of curiosity. Even rumor of their existence shaped behavior. Mothers instinctively defied, neighbors rationalized, and children conformed, not because of direct enforcement, but because the psychological imprint had become inseparable from their perception of reality. Each jar served as a reminder that the unseen could govern the visible, that obedience could be silently demanded, and that fear could be internalized as prudence. Her control of moral perception had become almost surgical. Guilt, empathy, loyalty, and hope were all tools she had sharpened and deployed with precision. Parents rationalized unexplainable events, neighbors excused absence and silence, and children internalized the expectation of obedience as moral law. The very act of questioning authority became psychologically perilous, a threat that the mind neutralized before it could manifest outwardly. In effect, she had weaponized human conscience itself. Timing, subtle intervention, and anticipation were her invisible instruments. Every conversation, gesture, and pause reinforced his system. Deviations were predicted, suspicion mitigated, and curiosity redirected. Her dominion was no longer contingent. It was structural, adaptive, and enduring. The town had become both a laboratory and her instrument, a self-perpetuating mechanism of control and compliance. As we move into the next section, prepare to see the full scope of her legacy. How the town's collective consciousness now operates as a guardian of her invisible rules, how obedience is normalized across generations, and how her system of domination achieves a form of immortality, continuing to shape lives long after the midwife herself is gone. By now, the horror of his system extends beyond individual families. It is cultural, structural, and generational. The town itself has become an instrument of obedience. Patterns of fear, vigilance, and rationalization are passed silently from parents to children, from neighbors to neighbors. Even those who sense something amiss find themselves constrained by internalized rules they cannot fully articulate. The midwife's dominion has evolved into a living, self-sustaining organism, invisible yet absolute.